When you look at them, they compare a group of dyslexics with a group of good readers, and they don't match them. Sometimes they don't even match them in age. Usually they don't match them in intelligence. So what you find may be the result of intelligence differences in the groups, rather than because one group is dyslexic. So you need to match them for confounding variables. You need to use appropriate tests and statistics, and if assessing interventions, it really needs to be a randomised controlled trial, and it needs to be double masked at the very least. So let's move to our first topic, measurement studies, and this is about...
What is the double mask?
Yeah, double mask, it used to be called double blind. So double mask, if you're, let's say you're comparing coloured lenses in a group of dyslexics, some of whom get coloured lenses, some of whom don't. Single mask would be if the practitioner doesn't know who gets which lenses.
Okay.
Double mask would be if the child doesn't know whether they've got the right lens or a control lens.
And the double is also the practitioner does not know and also the kid does not know?
That's right, yeah. Now triple mask would be the teachers don't know either. And we've done that in studies where we've given children 2 pairs of colour glasses, one of which should help them, one of which shouldn't. And they shouldn't know which is which. Now this is even important with vision therapy. If you're researching vision therapy, you need to have a control group. The control group needs to get something that is as convincing to them as vision therapy. So,
but with the lens, if it is filter lens, you can't do it single match or double match because you see it.
Yeah, you can.
It's not possible
if you pick a colour that's very similar and they don't know which is the one that's meant to help them. And I'll talk about that tomorrow. How you can do that in a research study. It's difficult, but it can be done with the colorimeter, because when they look in through the colorimeter, they don't know exactly what the colour is because they adapt to the colour. So you can trick them. So you need to be able to trick people, in other words. Now with spectacle lenses, for example, people did research on giving basin prism to people with exophoria. If you do that, you need to have control glasses that are similar thickness to those with a basin prism.
Okay, and what do you do? Why do you do the double match? It's one is enough, so that the patient won't know what he has.
No, because the practitioner...
Because you have to know, you are doing the research.
No, the practitioner can influence the result as well. And there's lots of research showing that if the patient doesn't know which is which, but the practitioner does, you're more likely to get a positive response than if the practitioner is masked as well. Because it's not just the patient who's subjective, we're subjective too. It's not the patient that's prone to their beliefs and their belief set. They are, but so are we. If we have a belief that a vision therapy we're researching works, we're going to find it works, by and large. So we need to be masked. So when we did a study at the Institute of Optometry on a vision therapy, I got a person in to do the measurements of whether it had worked or not who didn't know which treatment they had.
So it's more objective.
Yep.
When you do the single or the...
That's right. Yep. Yep. The whole thing is about being as perfectly objective as you can, so no one has expectations that could influence the result. Because we're all human beings, we will all have expectations, and they could all bias us in some way, cause us to be biased in some way. So you need a research design that will protect you against that. So if we look at measurement studies, this is dealing with a situation about equipment. And with instrument evaluations, we need to know a little bit of language. The first is reliability. Now, when I give this talk, I used to shoot for my county when I was young. And most people don't understand this, but you will, because you do military service, don't you? So if I were to say to you, you've got 2 guns, 2 rifles, one rifle produces that, they put them in a bench, you bolt them in, and one rifle produces that out of 4 shots, and the other rifle produces that, which is the better rifle?
No, top one.
Top one, yeah, top one, because you just adjust the sights and then it's perfect. So a lot of people say that's better, but this has got a bad spread. So as long as you can adjust the sights, this is the rifle you would want to buy, because the precision here is very good. The reliability of the measurements are very good. This is more about validity. So validity tells you how well the measurements represent the true state of affairs. Now, of course, if we're buying an instrument, say we're buying a new autorefractor, we want it to have both, don't we? We want it to be precise and to actually tell us what the refractive error is. And when you look at screening tests, we talked about coloured overlays earlier, screening for visual stress. Coloured overlays, you look at the screening test, how well it compares with the gold standard. So the one we might know best is a non-contact tonometer. When people evaluate a new non-contact tonometer, we did a study in London where we did this, where you do that sort of study, you compare it with gold. And what you do is you ask whether your non-contact tonometer is giving consistent readings, its precision, and valid readings, whether those readings compare well with the gold standard. And you work out the sensitivity and the specificity. And sensitivity, so if you've got your gold standard, let's say you've got a screening test that, let's say you're doing school screening in children. You're going into a school, you're giving a quick sight test to children to work out which children need to come and see you in your practice. So what you want to know is you want to know whether your, to what extent your screening test will detect the children that genuinely have the real visual problem. So we did this in a study. We looked at a new computerized, nothing to do with dyslexia, this was a study looking at a computerized vision screener that teachers could use in schools to screen children for visual problems. And we said, how well does this compare with a full eye exam at picking up visual problems? So if you looked at the people that were true positive, these are the people where the screening test says they've got the condition you're looking for, and the full eye exam says they have it. So you want to pick up all of those. You also, how many of those do you pick up compared with those where the screening test fails them, but the real test says they have the problem? So you look at the proportion of those who actually have the condition that the screening test detects. That's the sensitivity. So you want 100%, you never get it, never get it. Tonometry, for picking up people with glaucoma, its sensitivity is only, I think, about 60%. It's very poor at picking up people with glaucoma. But you do it in combination with other tests, and you get a better result. The specificity is about this, because a screening test doesn't just need to find the people who have the disease, it also needs to find the people who are normal, because otherwise you'd fail everyone, and then there's no point in doing the screening. So you need to know how good the screening test is at detecting those who are true negatives. So true negatives are those who, according to your gold standard, don't have the condition that you're looking for. And you need to know to what extent your screening test will detect those. You want it to detect 100% of those who are normal, which is this group, and it won't be 100%, but you want to know how good it is. And you can look at the overall accuracy by combining both sensitivity and specificity.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so tonometry is a good example. Is that the one that I've... No, okay, I've got a different example here. This is research that was done in Bradford many years ago with a mallet unit. So here's the mallet unit that you're familiar with for measuring, for detecting fixation disparity and measuring the associated phoria. And Pickwell and his group, they said, how good is the mallet unit at detecting symptomatic heterophoria? So people with a heterophoria that is decompensating to the extent that it's producing symptoms. How good is the mallet unit at detecting that? And so what they did was they worked out the sensitivity. And this is the sensitivity. Now, if the mallet test, if everyone that had a fixation disparity on the mallet unit had symptomatic phoria, it would pick up 100% of them, and it would be here. And what they said was, if you look at the aligning prism, the associated phoria, so the prism that corrects any fixation disparity, for pre-presbyopes, the red, these are under the age of 40. For pre-presbyopes, if you use as a cut-off one prism diopter, so if you say, I'm going to consider that everyone that needs one prism diopter to bring these strips into alignment has got symptomatic phoria, or has got a phoria that I think is symptomatic. How many of those people that need a prism of one to align these strips, how many of those people actually have symptoms? And what they found was 0.8, about an 80, I think it's a 79% sensitivity. So the test was very good. It picked up 79% of people with symptoms. Okay, 75%, sorry I exaggerated. The specificity is how good it is at picking up normal people. And this is 1 minus specificity, so that point is 78%. So in other words, if you look at the people who didn't have symptoms, which we're defining in this study as normal, 78% of people who don't have symptoms have a fixation disparity of less than 1. So the test is quite good. And these receiver operator curves, they plot the sensitivity and the specificity of a test for different cut-offs. So if you were screening for glaucoma, you would do a receiver operator curve for a cut-off of 21. And then you'd say, okay, how about 25? What you'd find is, if you have a lower cut-off, you get a higher sensitivity, but you get a lower specificity. Because if you had 16 as your cut-off, you'd pick up nearly everyone with glaucoma, but you'd refer lots of normal people as well. So this sort of graph tells you how good your test is at screening for a condition. Let's go now more to something that's relevant to the topic of this course, of looking at things like dyslexia and on Thursday, Down syndrome. So this is where researchers get very excited because we pick up correlates. So I've talked already this morning about one of the correlates of dyslexia, a condition that occurs more often in dyslexia than in good readers, which is visual stress. We're going to talk later today about binocular instability, a binocular vision problem that occurs more often in dyslexics than good readers. And these things are correlates, but you need to be careful, because people have said, well, it's easy to find correlates, but correlates are not the same as causes. And if you test, people have jokingly, this is a joke, but there's some truth in it, like all good jokes. This joke is that a normal person is just a person who hasn't been tested enough. If you put them through enough tests, they're going to fail it. And if we think about the Skeffington 21-point routine, now, if all of the tests were independent, if all of the 21 points were independent, which they're not, but if they were, and each of those you defined what's abnormal as the bottom 5% of the population, you'd expect everyone on average to fail at least one of those, wouldn't you? Because 5% of the population is 1 in 20. So you would fail 1 in 20 tests. So the more tests you do, the more likely it is that somebody is going to fail one of them. And when you do research, there's a thing called Bonferroni statistics. They always name a test after the person that invented it. Bonferroni was a statistician. And what he said was, the more tests you do in your research study, the smaller the p-value that you should require to be proven. So I said earlier, p less than 0.05 is generally taken as indicating that a result is statistically significant. But if you were testing the same thing in 10 ways, pardon me, then Bonferroni would say that you should adjust your p-value downwards because you've got 10 opportunities of finding significance. So he would say instead of p less than 0.05, p should be less than 0.005 because you need to divide it by 10. Now that's very relevant because when we think about what we do as an optometrist, if we test somebody in several different ways, we need to think about whether we apply those test results independently, in which case we need to allow for that fact, or whether we combine them. And we're going to talk later about how we combine the results of binocular vision tests. we also need to accept that just because two things are correlated, it doesn't mean that one is causing the other. There may be an underlying common cause. My classic example here is, we're going to talk later about binocular instability being correlated with dyslexia. And people sometimes say, aha, I found binocular instability in a dyslexic child, so that must be the cause of their dyslexia. Well, let's think of a different condition. Down syndrome. Down syndrome is known to be correlated with strabismus. You're more likely to have strabismus if you have Down syndrome than normal, much more likely. We don't ever find a strabismus in a child with Down syndrome and say, okay, I'll correct your strabismus and that will cure your Down syndrome. And yet, when we find binocular instability in dyslexics, we sometimes assume that if we correct their binocular instability, it will help their dyslexia. And really, we shouldn't assume that a correlate is necessarily a cause. Causality, when it is there, can be in either direction. So in America, there's a significant correlation between the number of doctors in a city and the number of people who die. Does that mean that doctors are causing patients to die? Probably not. It probably means that where you have older people, more people die, and where there are more old people who are ill, you get more doctors. So it's probably that causing that, but you don't know. My favourite one is there's a statistically significant correlation between the number of children born in a city and the number of storks. So you have this fable for children where when children say, where do babies come from, you say a stork brings the baby. Yeah. Is that why? Does that prove that storks bring babies? Probably not. Because where you have storks, yeah, big birds that carry, yeah. And the reason is, of course, that where you have more babies, you have more houses. Where there are more houses, there are more ponds and gardens. Where there are more ponds and gardens, there are more fish. Where there are more fish in ponds and gardens, you get more storks. But I prefer the carrying baby hypothesis myself. Oh, the other thing to say is about treatment. That just because something is correlated, it doesn't mean necessarily that it needs to be treated. Correlation is not the same as prediction. You need to control for confounding variables. And as you have more subjects in the study, and you might think this, you might look at a research paper and you might think, this research paper has 1,000 participants. This is really good. Much better than a research study with 100. And by and large, that's true. The exception is if you want to prove as a scientist that something that is a very small effect is significant, then often you exaggerate the number of participants. Because the more subjects you have in a study, the more likely it is that a very small effect will be significant. So this brings back the point of you need to say, yes, is what I found in this research study statistically significant? But then you need to say, is it clinically significant as well? Does it actually make a real difference? Is it likely to make a real difference? This is one of my favourite quotes in dyslexia. A respected researcher in the 1970s, Benton, who said it will be difficult to find a task on which dyslexic children have not been reported to be deficient. And it's true, actually. They often seem to do poorly when you test them. So, you know, you could come up with 1,000,001 theories about things that could be causing dyslexia. So let's look at this difference between statistical significance and clinical significance. And throughout the rest of this talk, I'm going to show you some examples of dodgy research. Deliberately exaggerated, made to look dodgy to make a point. So here's a study we did. People had said, we talked earlier about visual stress, Mears-Irlen syndrome, about this benefit from coloured filters. And we were interested in whether maybe people had an accommodative problem, and that's why they get the blurring, and they don't need coloured filters at all, it's because they've got an accommodative problem. So we looked at a group of people with Irlen syndrome, or with visual stress, and a group of controls who didn't have visual stress. And we looked at their amplitude of accommodation, and it was different, and we tested it with a t-test, and it was less than 0.05, so they had, the people with visual stress had significantly lower accommodation than the controls. So does this mean that it's the poor accommodation that is causing the visual stress? Maybe not. No, maybe not. And there are some dodgy things I've done here. To make a point, I've done some bad science. The first thing I've done that's bad is this doesn't go down to 0. Really, I should have made this y-axis go down to 0. By only showing you a part of the scale, I've exaggerated, made the difference look bigger between the groups. The second bad science that I've done here to make a point is I've not put the error bars on. So this tells you what the average is, but it doesn't tell you about the spread of the data, about the standard deviation. And that should be on there as well. And when I show you the actual data, because there weren't a lot of people in this study, only 24 and 15, not many. These are the actual data. Here, each point is a person. And the red points are the control group, and the blue points are the people with visual stress. And you can see it is the same as this graph. So the people with visual stress are lower, and the blue points are on average a bit lower, aren't they? The centre of gravity of the blue points is a bit lower than the centre of gravity of the red ones. But could you, looking at these data, could you say that every patient with visual stress has worse accommodation than everyone without visual stress? Absolutely not. When you look at the data like this, does that statistically significant difference really mean anything? I don't think so. You get lots of patients with visual stress with really good accommodation and a few with bad accommodation. But amongst people without visual stress, you get most with good accommodation and a few with bad accommodation. So I don't think it's clinically significant, although it was statistically significant. Now let's finish now by talking about where the evidence-based approach is absolutely essential. And this relates to interventions, to when we start to treat things. And I researched a few years ago, I had a PhD student looking at treatments for migraine. He wasn't looking at this, I just got interested at the time in mail order magazines and the ridiculous things in mail order magazines that claimed to treat migraine. Here was my favourite one, second favourite. So this is a band you wear around your head and you put a magnet near your temples to help your migraine. Any evidence? No. And this was the best. This is a serious treatment sold in a magazine that came through my door. And this is a cold hat. So you put ice in this hat and you put it on your head and it's meant to alleviate migraine. No evidence, I don't think, that it works. Oh, more magnets, I forgot about this one. This is magnets that you put in the sole of your shoe to help your migraines. There are so many wacky ideas out there and we need to be better than the people who are selling these. And the first thing these sorts of companies do, when you go to these websites of these companies, they have testimonials there. They have patients who are written in saying how good they are. The next tier of evidence they would give you is a case series. They'd say, we looked at 20 people who bought our magnets and 18 of them said things were better. Is that convincing? No, absolutely not. You need to be aware of anecdotal comments. This person, a French researcher, said nearly every discarded popular therapy has been promoted by a series of favourable cases. In America, the Federal Drug Administration, their big body that approves medicines, only started asking for evidence of drug effectivity in 1962. That's really quite recent. See, I was born, it's very recent. So it's quite recent, and it's only in the last few years, last 55 years, that they've started asking for evidence. They only started insisting on randomized controlled trials in 1970. So the evidence-based movement has only really started to pervade the healthcare sciences in the last 50 years. So historical beliefs, things that we were taught when we were training that work, need to be evaluated as well as new treatments. Now I love Voltaire, French philosopher. He looks French, doesn't he? And he came up with some great quotes. He said that practical therapeutics is the art of keeping the patient entertained until nature effects the cure. And we need to bear that in mind. When we give somebody vision therapy and they come back and we say, is it getting better? And they say yes, this all we're doing? Is it just waiting for nature to effect a cure? So the evidence-based movement is trying to say, let's go better than a case series. The bottom tier is useful but not much better than nothing is expert opinion. Case series come above that, and then case control studies. So the sort of thing I've talked about so far, where you control...
I found several for you to choose from. Doctor Who, S10, Series 10, The Handmaid's Tale, S1, The Handmaid's Tale S1, Victoria.
I'll turn that off. So that's Siri picking up something I said. So that just proves that Apple are listening. I blame Trump, so. It won't let me turn it off. Okay, so let's hope that will shut up now. So if we go up the hierarchy of evidence, the next best form of evidence is a systematic review of case control studies, but the evidence starts to become convincing when you get to a cohort study. Cohort study is when you follow a group over time, and the best sort of cohort study is the randomized control trial. And we'll talk about the design of that in a few moments. And when the evidence-based movement says that things are really convincing is when there's a systematic review of randomized controlled trials that all tell you the same thing. So if you look, for example, at the evidence for salt being unhealthy, I'm not an expert on this, but I've read that there are good systematic reviews of all of the trials about salt and diet, and saying that excessive salt is likely to be correlated with heart disease. So what's a cohort study? A cohort study is where you identify two groups, the cohorts, and you follow those cohorts over time, and only one of those groups receive the exposure of interest. Now if we're talking about researching in vision therapy or prisms, then that is the exposure of interest, the intervention that we might be giving them. The other group doesn't, and it's usually prospective. You follow those cohorts over time to see if they get the outcome of interest. If it's a drug, you're looking to see if they get better, for example. So something you might do, I'm interested in fish oils and whether they're healthy. So you might give fish oils to one group and monitor both groups for heart disease over time. The groups are defined on the basis of the risk factor, those that get the fish oils and those that don't, and compared in the outcome whether they get heart disease or not. And it's characterised by being observational, you're observing people, and longitudinal, you're observing them over time. Now, occasionally they can be retrospective. A retrospective cohort study, the best example I've come across of this is when they did research in America. They looked at people in the last World War II who went to Japan and therefore had a diet that was high in fish oil, and compared them with people that went to Germany and that had a diet that wasn't so high in fish oil. And they said, okay, did they have different heart disease after a number of years in each country? So that's a retrospective type of cohort study. But the best design for looking at interventions is what we've talked about already. It's a randomised, double-masked, placebo-controlled trial. And you must select your subjects, and a key thing here is that you need to specify